Welcome to Transcendent Psych. If you were, let's say, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes novels, and you're kind of writing your story, and then suddenly Sherlock Holmes pops out of the page and he says to you, Arthur, what's the meaning of my life? What would you say to him? Well, it seems like a bizarre question to ask, but we're kind of exploring this because we're going to be looking at Dr. Sam Leben's, a philosopher and a rabbi. His suggestion that we might find greater meaning in life if we realize that at some level we are authored characters in an authored world within an ultimate mind. So he's a theist, so he believes within the mind of God, but this still could hold even if you're not a theist per se. So a lot of my viewers are idealists. That means they believe that consciousness or mind is the fundamental level of reality and that everything else exists within a kind of ultimate mind. And we're going to be kind of wondering whether this way of thinking might add additional resources to our quest as human beings to find meaning in life. That's our topic today, so welcome. Can I just ask a little favour of you if you've not subscribed already? I've got, a lot of videos that have got maybe 2,000-3,000 people have viewed, sometimes 100 plus likes, but not all of you clearly have subscribed. So it would be great if you would just take a moment now to click the subscribe button. It does help the channel and it gives you instant access. We've got about 850, 870 subscribers at the moment, and it'd be great to just push ourselves up to 1,000 soon. Thank you for that. Okay, so we're thinking first of all about theism and meaning, because a lot of theists argue that the only way you can really have objective meaning in life is if God exists. The argument goes that you need some kind of grounding for meaning to be real. In other words, unless creation, the cosmos, you and I are part of a intended and wanted and valued scheme, if you like, by the divine, then we don't have meaning. We can't have meaning or value in our lives. And that might seem a bit abstract to some people, but the argument will go something like, if there is no ultimate purpose and no ultimate source that intended everything to be here, then it's all just kind of arbitrary, and we can try and concoct meanings and place those meanings onto our lives, but that's just a kind of confabulation, a kind of storytelling that we're imposing on an ultimately meaningless existence. Now, I'm going to be working my way through aspects of Dr. Sam Leben's paper, I think it was 2015, 2014, where he explores this question of meaning within an idealist frame of thinking. Now, his is a theistic idealism, but this could still work whether you have that or not, I think, to some extent. Now, the argument he makes is that actually it's a problem to say that you can only have meaning in life if God exists, because you could have, for example, non-naturalist atheists, so that's people that don't think everything is just explained by nature, but you have a world where you have, for example, Platonic forms, but there is no divinity, but a world where there's like mathematical Platonic forms that necessarily kind of exist. And there is kind of meaning, the value and meaning is kind of a fact, and ethics are a kind of fact built into the cosmos at that Platonic level. So he says, actually, it's not quite as straightforward as simply saying you'd have to have a God in order to have meaning or value in that way. Fair enough. I'm sure there's lots of theists that might make arguments against that. I know William Lane Craig would say, yes, but Platonic forms are not causally effective, they're just sort of ideas. So yeah, how would that work? He may say that. I don't know. Maybe I'm misquoting him. So that's what theists often say. And then Sam is saying, no, actually, the non-naturalist atheist can push back on that and still have a world of objective meaning and value. Sam Leben says, well, that's okay, that's true, but a more sort of useful and apposite point to make, perhaps, is that of philosopher Thomas Nagel. And Thomas Nagel argues that actually, whether there is a God or not is kind of moot, really, because ultimately what humans have to do is to make meaning within their own lives and within the human story. We're going to be coming back to that. Notice the connection to stories. Because he says, like, there's a famous woodcuts, aren't there, where you've got like the heavens, like medieval woodcut, you've got the heavens and the stars and the dome, and then this character is kind of on the earth and poking his head out through the dome and looking out at the stars. And it's a bit like that. So Thomas Nagel saying, look, when we try and poke our heads out of the human story, out of the world of our thinking, and we try to take a view from nowhere, as he puts it, which is this sort of divine, sort of this kind of abstract attempt at arriving at meaning, he basically says it doesn't work. We can't do this view from nowhere. Human beings need and do find their meaning through being grounded in, I guess, as a psychotherapist, I might say this, that through the sets of associations and meanings and stories within which we locate ourselves. So to say that anything I do, say, I don't know, let's say me making this video, to say that's meaningful to me is meaningful within a set of values I have, that I might value you as an audience, and maybe trying to help people make sense of their lives a bit more. I might find meaning in Sam Leben's work and having my mind stretched by good thinkers, etc. Like, that meaning is being derived from that interaction with the human world. And so actually, just on a practical level, but also in a philosophical sense as well, meaning is only made through the connection to other things that actually matter to us. So none of us actually really find our meaning from a really kind of abstract way of thinking from outside of our real lives. Okay, so I think that's a really, really good point. And so were it the case that there were no God and the universe is headed ultimately to a cold heat death, I don't know, just whatever it's called, all the galaxies just disappear from each other and everything gets further and further apart until finally the last star goes out and I'm no longer here, you're no longer here, what have you. Does that actually mean that what I'm doing day to day is meaningless? Now, Sam Leben says, well, actually, theism might add meaning to the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have no meaning when we're actually getting on with our lives, because the reality is we kind of find our meaning in the world and the stories in which we live, of which we're part of a bigger human story. Okay, let's move on. Lebens sets out something which he calls hassidic idealism, and he sets out the view that our meaning is found in being characters and participants in a divine story, in the divine mind that God or the divine is authoring. So that's his position. Why does he take this approach? Well, he's a theist and he's Jewish, but what he's trying to do is to say that in his theology, God must be, and lots of theological philosophers would say this, God is likely to be a perfect being. Like, we tend to not give the attribution of the name God to something which is just a thing and is imperfect, okay, that is lacking something or wanting something. And so then it throws up this problem for theists, because it's like, well, if God then is the creator or the source of the cosmos is not just to be identified with the cosmos, but is the source of the cosmos, then has God actually then added something to the state of affairs and improved things? Well, if God is all sufficient and this perfect being, then God can't have made things better. You can't add to your perfect set of, the state of things. But at the same time, we can look at this world and we can think, well, actually, maybe it could be seen as in some senses, as making things worse. There was, if you like, beforehand, just the perfection of God, and then we've got an imperfect world added in. So the state of affairs is now a perfect being, then an imperfect world. So what does Sam try to do? Well, he tries to say actually that what God is doing is God is actually, rather than creating something real outside of himself, God is not actually really creating anything real and new. God is actually withdrawing conceptual space within God's mind, and God is creating the illusion of a world. Okay, so this in Hasidic idealism is called, or Hasidism generally is called, Tzimtzum. So the idea is that God has made contracted a space for finitude, if you like, within the infinite. So there's a kind of contraction, and this is at the level of mind, within God's mind. Now, we might object, if that were not the case, that has God actually then kind of experienced a subtraction, or has God created a world in his mind that has kind of sullied God's mind, that is less than the perfection of the divine being? And so that objection needs thinking about as well. And Sam Leben says, no, the answer that Hasidic idealism can give to that question is that actually, if the world is fundamentally an idea within mind, it's an illusion really, then the idea within God's mind is not the same as, is not identical to God's mind. And we might be puzzled at that for a second, but if you just think about it for a minute, Lebens offers this argument. He says, well, like you and I, we're sharing ideas at the moment. All right, but my mind hasn't suddenly become your mind. I mean, I'm talking to my camera and making a YouTube video. I don't even know necessarily who you are listening to this. Okay, so, but my mind and your mind have not suddenly become one mind. We're sharing ideas. Now, if that's possible, I can have ideas and you can have ideas, but the ideas aren't equivalent to our minds. So I can have an idea that comes through my mind and the idea passes away again. So can you, and my mind is still there. Okay, so the idea here is that God's mind can have ideas that are distinct from God's mind. So the conceptual idea of the world within God's mind does not mean that God's mind is then sullied or reduced because there are ideas within God's mind that might be less than perfect. Okay, and if we think about that, like I can write a story about a terrible character without actually becoming that character. I can write a story about a murderer, axe murderer or something, without actually becoming an axe murderer. Hope that makes sense. I'm just going to plug in very quickly because my computer is losing its power. Right. Okay, so there we go. We hopefully set the scene somewhat there to make sense of things and where we're going. So where does that leave us as people within this scheme of thinking? If true, it would mean that we occupy a fictional world in God's mind in which we are fictional characters from the divine perspective. does this then actually really help us with meaning, with making sense of our lives? If we're all fictions, then isn't it all meaningless? Well, not if we look at it from the point of view of the characters in the story. When we're in the story has meaning. It is actually from the divine point of view that the story could potentially not have meaning. Okay, maybe God doesn't need meaning in that sense, but we'll explore the idea of why an author might write or create or have a dream or write a story in the first place a bit later. The thing I think to really hold on to here is that from the human point of view, from the character's point of view, we are in the story grounded and not taking what Thomas Nagel we referred to earlier. We're not taking that kind of view from nowhere perspective. And so therefore our lives can be meaningful within the story as soon as we start to try and take a divine point of view on the human story. Then it might seem too abstract and too difficult to actually get any sense of meaning. That maybe we're not meant to find meaning outside of the human story, while maybe acknowledging that the human story is about something to God. We come back to that in a minute. So the next question I want to ask is, does that then mean that our stories don't matter to God? So we're back to that question. Well, we can ask if the Holmes stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories, mattered to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. At one level, we can say, well, yes, he's expressing something of himself. I mean, authors don't bother writing stories if there's no desire to do so within them. Okay, so clearly stories at some level matter to their authors, otherwise we can assume they wouldn't pick up pen and put them to paper. But at another level, we call this level 2, we might say no. God or the divine would also be aware that what goes on in the story and the characters in the story, it's just a fiction. And in that sense, it doesn't matter in the same way as those things, which would just be God's self, that are ultimately real. Remember, in this scheme of Dr. Sam Leben, the only reality really is God. All right, so if you just have an author who writes a story in his mind, then the only real thing is the author. The story exists only in a fictional way in the mind of the author. Another alternative we might consider would be that, well, authors do get invested in their stories. Okay, they write sequels, they get emotionally stirred up, not necessarily saying that we need to think of God in that way or the divine, but they get stirred up when they have to kill a character off. They feel like they know their characters. Right? These are personalities and characters that exist in their mind. They might feel they have some sort of sense of relationship to them. So that's an interesting point of view that Lebens doesn't quite get into here in that paper, but I think it's an interesting one to consider. Some authors, of course, something Lebens does talk about in some of his papers, some authors enter into the story. So Kurt Vonnegut does this. So he enters into stories and has a dialogue with characters as a character himself in the story. Of course, his character in the story is fictional, but it is kind of him, the true Kurt Vonnegut, entering in as the fictional Kurt Vonnegut. But we're kind of interestingly kind of blurring lines there. But he's obviously, if he's having an interaction with the characters in his story, he's not kind of really having an interaction with the characters in the story because the characters aren't real. They don't really exist. But yeah, interesting set of questions there. But I think really useful point to make is that if you think about it, authors are always implicit. They're always there in their stories. Like you can look at, I don't know, the Harry Potter novels, Sam Lebens talks about this, and you won't find a reference to J.K. Rowling anywhere in those stories. So from the point of view of the story, she is 100% absent. She doesn't exist, which is interesting, right? If you're an atheist listening to this, it might be like, well, I've never met God. I can't see God. Would that be a bit like a character saying, actually, well, I've never met this author you talk about? And yet some theists might say, but the author's implicit in the very existence, the very being of reality. That's why we're here. Okay. So this implicit idea, I think, is really interesting. And it's really difficult for authors actually to, well, it's impossible, I would say, for authors not to be implicit in their stories, and even in how the stories and the plots and the characters unfold. There's something expressed in the story of the author. And this brings us on to something Lebens talks about, this idea of metaphor. And he talks about the unbearable lightness of being by Kundera, the author. And in that novel, no, not in the novel, sorry. Well, in the novel, there's a character called Tamsin, but commenting on his novel, Kundera sort of describes how this woman, Tamsin, is not born a woman. Well, she's not. She's a fictitious character, but she's born of a metaphor. She's born of Kurt Vonnegut writing his story and having this character interact with the plot and the other characters in a certain way. She comes to meaning and being for Kundera in the struggles that she has, and in so doing, she exists in a sense because she's a metaphor and expressing a struggle that he's interested in exploring. So Lebens introduces this idea that maybe we are all, in a sense, all our lives and all events that happen in life are imbued with meaning, and that everything has its origin in a kind of semantic and symbolic level in the mind of God that this story is unfolding. And our task, in a sense, is to perhaps step back, not try and understand everything about life and try to think we've understood the entire meaning of life or anything like that, but to be open to the idea that there is rich meaning in life, and that the people that we meet are characters playing out a role in the divine story. And he points out, of course, that in our own lives, we are the main character in the story God is writing in our lives from our point of view. From other people's point of view, we may be kind of, supporting cast, or we might be incidental, or we may be completely absent. And that's an interesting point of view when you think of, how do I live my life? Do I see myself as the center of the universe at one level? We all do. And we do that, especially when we're very young. But as we get older, what we are wanting to do is to try and see more and more of what life is unfolding from the point of view of others and other characters and the wider plot and the story, and where we fit into this. So that's I think quite a healthy sort of psychological point of view to take. A balance between valuing yourself and others. And Lebens gives this lovely little story of a rabbi called Rabbi Simcha of Peshisha, around about the year 1767, I think, in which the rabbi would carry two pieces of paper in two pockets of his jacket. On one piece of paper it says, "The world was created for me," and in the other pocket, on another piece of paper, he's written, "I am but dust and ashes." It's a really interesting concept, that can we hold these two things together, that at one level within the story, I am absolutely central to this and I'm really important. I'm the main character in my life. And at another level, I'm really nothing. I'm dust and ashes, and the story ultimately is a fiction. Not that the rabbi necessarily had that last idea in mind, but yeah, that you can get this balance between seeing the world from a completely with yourself at the center. As I look out, as I'm making this video, I can see the sea outside my window. I can see everything else. I'm at the center, whichever direction I look, I'm at the center of my reality, but I'm not at the center of everybody else's reality, and I may not even be on their map. And it's just, there are a lot of people that think they are the center of the reality, or a lot of people that just think I don't matter at all. And it's worth just thinking about how we get that balance there, just on a practical level. Well, let's bring this on more philosophically. So if we're fictional characters from the divine point of view, we want to ask ourselves, okay, in what sense then are we real? What does that mean? Are we real then? Well, the answer to that, Lebens says, is, well, yes, we are. Within the story, and that's all that really is going to matter to the characters, because they're living in the story. Within the story, they are real. Sherlock Holmes is not stressing over the fact about whether he exists. And Lebens has this nice little joke going on where he says, look, actually in reality, I think it was it 221 Baker Street or something like that, that house didn't exist on Baker Street in London. But Holmes isn't stressing about whether it's actually real. It's real within the story. It doesn't matter. We're in the story. We're not in the abstract. We're living below that dome of that woodcut I described earlier. So it doesn't matter. That's the reality in which we live. But at another level, no, we are figments in the mind of God, in Lebens' view here. Now, Lebens doesn't discuss a question that I think is really interesting in this paper, and I haven't heard him discuss it elsewhere. Now, if I ask you, we're talking about reality and what's real and what we can know for sure. If I ask you, what can you know without doubt? Some of you may be mindful of René Descartes' cogito, where he says, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. Meaning in that exploration of his that the only thing he cannot doubt is that he is. Right? Because if he doubts that, then where are all these doubts coming from? Like a nothing cannot doubt. So what do we say to Lebens' idea that we are fictions if we've got actually this indubitable fact? I mean, you can't doubt your reality without the question becoming meaningless. All right, so I have to exist, don't I? Well, that cogito ergo sum stretches things a bit too far. What do we mean by I think, therefore I am? What do we mean by I in that? Because we can split the difference between a sense of I, which is consciousness. I cannot doubt consciousness, well, unless you're certain types of, is it Daniel Dennett? Unless you're certain types of philosophers, but you can't doubt consciousness without falling into absolute absurdity. Well, I'm aware that I'm even wondering whether awareness is real. Embedded, implicit within that question and that search is the fact of consciousness. What I can doubt are the contents of my consciousness. For example, when I dream at night, I could ask, well, is my consciousness real? Well, yeah, my consciousness is real. Awareness itself is real, but the contents, the dream contents, are not. They are fictional stories being played out. But there's still the same consciousness that I have in my waking life. But again, the contents of my waking life, I can't hold them as absolutely certain. I mean, I could be living in a matrix. I could be being deceived, in Descartes' analogy, by this demon creating reality in his version of the story. I could be a brain in a vat being fed all these inputs and stimuli. It's living in some kind of virtual reality. I can't prove that the world that I observe is real. What I cannot doubt is the consciousness that is having those doubts and having those questions. So if we come back to Leben's view, I would say actually what we cannot doubt is that we are real in the sense of consciousness itself. But what we can't be sure of is the contents of consciousness. Now, this, I think, fits really beautifully with idealism generally, but hassidic idealism as well. The basic sense of consciousness is just this kind of I am. I think, therefore, I am. But it's an I, let's be careful here, it's an I in the sense of just awareness, not I in the sense of my name's Rob and I live in the south of England. Those things are like, well, those could be part of a dream, okay? But the thing that I can't doubt, this I, is just the awareness that has either these truths or these illusions going through it. This fits really well. This sense of I am, for Hasidic idealism, they name God as I am. Non-dualist thinkers, for example, will often say, like in Hindu Vedanta, will have this idea that at the base of our being is just this constant I am, which they equate with the divine. This is the divine substrate. If you go into Bernardo Kastrup's thinking, just pure mind at large, and other idealists, that consciousness is the substrate of reality that is just being itself and a kind of being and knowing itself. So we could argue, and still fit this in nicely into Sam's view, that at the level of just pure awareness and consciousness, I am not a fiction. But this is arguably the divine perspective. And if you're a meditator, you'll have noticed that, when you try to meditate, you'll have all your own thoughts and your own sense of awareness. If you get into a really deep state of meditation, that sort of falls away, and what you're left with is just this luminous mind, they call it. There's just this sense of being aware and being aware of awareness. That's just awareness. It's not an easy state to reach, but it is interesting because that fits quite well with this idea that there just is consciousness. That's the divine point of view. There's no sort of trying to make sense of everything from that point of view. It's just awareness of awareness. But within our experience, within awareness, there come these experiences of the contents of consciousness. And me, I have my story and my perspective, looking out at the world from my point of view. And you have it from your point of view. And someone in 1590 had it from their point of view. But all of this, arguably, is the divine mind dreaming finite characters up and maybe experiencing the story or the dream, if you like, from multiple, maybe infinite vantage points. Because this might be going on in other worlds, right? Across the whole universe, or universes, right? We don't need to limit it. So there we go. I think in a sense we can say in summary there that the only thing that has reality ultimately in Leben's view is the divine. But that's what we're experiencing in life. We're experiencing this ultimate awareness. What's the fiction potentially in Leben's view here, and marrying this a little bit with sort of non-duality, is the story that is experienced. If you go to Rupert Spira's work, you'll see this idea of consciousness being the screen, the background screen, and then the movie that's played out on the screen is the world and us. But it's all there is really is the screen. Okay, so this fits. These thinkers thinking fit together quite nicely. Let's move on a bit. So the question that comes up then a lot with this is free will. Have we got free will? Leben's answer to this is, well, yes, in the story we have free will. Hamlet in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the Hamlet play, has free will. He makes actual decisions based on what makes sense to him in the story. But at a different level, no, he doesn't have free will. Shakespeare is writing the script. Shakespeare determines Hamlet's decisions. Well, this is interesting, right? So here we've got a philosophy in Sam Leben's view that has free will and has determinism. Make sense of that, if you will. Now, I'm just going to show a quick clip here, which I think is interesting on another question we might ask at this point.
Brian Ballard came on my show, and we were talking about this because he's working on like narrative realism, and he was saying maybe it's like a choose your own adventure story where right, where it's like kind of like Molinism, and there's a bunch of options, and so God wouldn't ever let it the libertarianism run amok and make it a bad story. He couldn't do that, but he's given all these different options, and so you can choose how the story goes, perhaps.
So in some places I've called that weak Hasidic idealism.
Nice.
Is the idea that somehow God has created the world with figments of his imagination, but somehow, because God is so much more powerful than any author we can imagine, his merely fictional creatures are actually agents, and therefore they get to make choices or whatever. But I'm into the extreme Hasidic idealism, which is what I think the Hasidic tradition, which is that actually no, like, we are agents. Of course, we're agents in the story, right?
Yes.
But from God's perspective, it doesn't make sense to say that we could have made it go differently.
Right.
Okay, as well, that was interesting. He's raising the next question I was going to ask here, which is, could a divine mind generate a self-authoring world or worlds? Like, God kind of can sort of step back and he's kind of authoring this kind of make your own venture story. Now, what unfolds from that? Let's say God, the divine, ultimate consciousness, whatever you prefer to call the source, let's say does that, okay? In choose your own venture stories, it will be like, it's not a free-for-all, but you might get to page 25 and then it says go to page 32, or you can, and this is what happens, or you can go to page 41 and this is what happens, or go to page 57 and this is what happens, and you choose, and then you get bifurcations and it goes off from each of those options that you choose from there. Now, could the divine author do that and know all the different possible outcomes? Sure, in theory. But wouldn't then the divine author know which outcome would be chosen by the characters as well? Well, there's an interesting set of questions we can think about. So, is that different from Sam's position? Yeah, I think it is in a way, but it brings up other kind of questions that you might want to think about, and do put that in the chat. That'd be an interesting thing to think about. Last area I want to get into here is what we might call the problem of evil. Okay, I discussed this in my last video, but I'm not going to labor it too much, but it's an interesting and important thing to discuss if we're going down Lebens' kind of idealism, right? I think in a way, this idea of the world being a fiction within the mind of God changes the classical problem of evil. The problem of evil, classically defined, is this. If God is a perfect being, is all good, all knowing, all powerful, and yet has created a world in which there exists evil, how can those two things go together? Does he either not know what's going on and therefore cannot change the world, or does he know but not care, in which case he's not all loving, or does he know and care but he's not powerful enough to change anything, in which case he's not omniscient? So this is the classical problem of evil for the classical theistic God, a God is defined as all powerful, all knowing, and all loving. There are all sorts of ways in which theists and theologians will offer alternatives to that, and maybe actually God isn't all knowing in some sense, or maybe we only see a partial picture, so he's all loving, and actually this is part of an unfolding onward journey. God has limited his power for greater good in various ways, etc. So these are called theodicies. Most theodicies have something interesting to say, but I think none of them really kind of square the circle, if you like. Okay. With Sam's Hasidic idealism, we're in an interesting, slightly different scenario, because evil, in that sense of the things that go on in the world, it doesn't have any what we might call ontological reality. It's a fiction. So, for example, if I can't remember who the author is of The Clockwork Orange, but let's say I'm the author of The Clockwork Orange, which is quite a violent story. Have I actually created evil? Well, no, the story is not real. Is it that I don't care? Well, there's nothing real ultimately to care about. And of course, the characters aren't real. The only consciousness that exists is my own, and I'm experiencing it. If we take what I said a minute ago to be true, I'm experiencing it as like a virtual VR headset, and it's me. It's just me, really, entering into this conceptual illusion. Okay, and so in a sense, on Sam's view, evil actually doesn't really exist. It's just fiction. And so actually, in some senses, the problem of evil is solved. But at another level, there are problems still, because, well, I could say, well, I'm still existing in this world. But from the divine point of view, there's not a problem, because it's just a fiction. I'm a fiction, and you're a fiction, and the world's a fiction. Now, the difficulty we might say is, well, then why is the author creating a story in which evils happen? Does it matter? Well, if it's a fiction, not really, in some senses. But then you're still asking, well, why do it? And that I can't answer. But we might ask a further question, which is, does creating evils in a story, because remember, in this version, the author is the only reality. The divine mind is the only reality. Does telling yourself a story actually do harm to the consciousness itself, to the only thing that really is? And I would say, I don't think so. I'm happy to listen to different points of view on this, but as I said in my last video, if I sit here and dream up the scenario where I'm hacking my foot off, it might be grim to think about, but actually, I'm not really doing myself any harm. My foot's still there. It's just an imagined world. But we might ask other questions as well. I'm not going to try and answer these, but we might ask questions like, well, does the author of the story enter into the suffering of the characters in the story? I mean, authors, when they write stories, often get quite emotional. I mean, Lebens relates the example of Count Leo Tolstoy crying over one of his characters when the story unfolds. When the story unfolds, so the character jumps off of something and kills herself. He gets quite upset. And that's interesting. Well, obviously, with a divine mind, we might be making a false analogy here to a human mind, but it's not inconceivable that the author might be invested in the characters, even while the author knows that the characters are ultimately fictions. They could still be loved in a sense, which is interesting. Okay, well, I'm going to basically end that there, but what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do put comments in and tell me where you think this theory is strong, where you think it is weak, what questions does it leave you with? And also, please, just remind you, if you would subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. Give the old algorithm a tickle by tickling the like button as well. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Take care.